Welcome back. We're diving back into this Morgan PR36. Spoke to the owner, and I replaced the short bushing switchcraft output jacks, which had no tooth washers, with the long bushing jacks, which do have lock washers, the tooth washers. So these jacks are now very, very tight to this chassis. It will not go anywhere. So you're much less likely to lose an output transformer because the jack came loose. Nice to spend an extra 50 cents per jack to protect a $200, $300 output transformer. Second of all, while this amp is overall a pretty straight copy of a Princeton with a couple of changes because they didn't want to have an extra tube in it, they just copied the stock filtering. You can see that in the previous video. 22, 22, 22, 22. The original Princeton was 20, 20, 20, 20. And the reason the old Princetons were like that is the Princeton was essentially a student model, and they were trying to save costs wherever they could. So like the Champ, instead of having individual axial caps under a doghouse, they had a single multi-section cap can, which is right here between the board and the power transformer. And they used 2020 2020 because that was a cheap Mallory that was, good enough for a student model amp. Well, this is not a student model amp. This thing's a very expensive low wattage amp. So I increased the filtering to be much more like what you'd find in some of the Princeton's big brothers. So 47, 47, 22, 22. I'm not worried about stress on the rectifier from that first 47, while the data sheet max capacitance there is like 63 or 64 microfarad. 47 is going to be fine, and it does have these diodes protecting, in series before the rectifier tube, which helps with some stuff, and I think this is going to be just fine. And by increasing the filtering of the anode and screen supplies, that lowered the background hum in the amp a good bit. But at that point, there was still more background hum than I would like. And I looked at this, and I don't want to take the whole thing apart and rebuild it and charge the client out the wazoo on what was an expensive amp to begin with. And it's also a very difficult amp to do that kind of redesign work on because this is actually a PCB. It looks on camera like an eyelet board like you'd find in a Fender, but it's a PCB with large traces and pads that work kind of like an eyelet, though you can't solder and desolder and solder and desolder too many times without things going wrong. Here you can see one of the traces, but there are traces all on both sides of this board. The dark conformal coating kind of hides its nature, but you can see traces here and here and here and here. As PCBs go, it's okay. But that means that the existing connections are there, and if I needed to change them, I'd be taking the whole board out and cutting traces and redoing stuff. And just didn't want to, I didn't want to bill the client a ton if it was just getting it optimal. B, I didn't want someone hearing this thing and loving how it sounded once all that was done and saying, oh, I need to go get one of those Morgan PR36s. And then, $2,000 plus later, they get one and it's a hummy nightmare like this was when it came in. Now, I will upgrade certain amps without thinking twice. But when it's a company that charges this much and delivers this little, I don't want to fix what's inside to the point where it's false advertising as to what you're going to get. I'm already skirting the line with these changes. But anyway, they had the ground bias made to be a white wire, because everyone knows you use a white wire for ground, right? That was going to this filter cap negative here, which is the phase inverter negative, though it's tied to all these on the board, and then goes to ground to chassis through this black and white wire, which goes to a ground lug here, which also has this orange wire on it. This orange wire is the HT center tap, which is one of the two noisiest grounds in the entire amp. So stepping back at this point, I looked at it from Fender's perspective. This is a copy of a Princeton. This amp hums. Princetons don't hum. What's different? Well, number one, the Princeton does not have the HT center tap going to the same point on the chassis as all the filter caps. So I am about to move that to one of these unused connections here, just like I moved this connection for the phase inverter ground. Number two, the bias negative, actually it's bias positive, the bias ground point in a Princeton does not go to the same point on the chassis as the filter cap grounds, which are shared in a Princeton. So I removed that wire going from here to here, installed this new black wire. I like black or green for grounds. I'm crazy that way. And brought that to this point here, which is shared with the cathode of this output tube. And this is where the bias limiting resistor was grounded. So we have a bias ground reference here already, a bias ground reference here, and that is a very short loop between those 2 points. But it also had a bias ground reference here, which goes to here. So here to here was a big loop. So we had 3 bias ground references, making a big loop, and this one used to be to one of the noisiest points in the amp. So by moving this ground connection from here to here, that also reduced hum a lot. So by increasing the filtering and moving this bias reference ground, the hum dropped a lot, but there was still more than I wanted. And a very nice tech in Germany named Oliver told me that he was working on a Morgan PR12, I think he said, which is the same amp with different output tubes. And he also had a hum that was hard to track down. In Germany, it was 100 hertz. Here in the States, it's 120. And you get partials like 240, etc. But I digress. And the fix he found for that was he installed another cap from the wiper of the bias supply to this ground point right here. And he used a 10 microfarad. I did not have one in axial form handy. Well, I have 2, but I'm saving them for a Marshall I'm about to redo. So I put in this 22, which is fine. And I mean, you already have 4 times the Fender value here. And that greatly reduced the remaining hum. So that's a very good Band-Aid. Thank you very much, Oliver. Dankeschön. And that's a nice thing to know for future Morgans, because while this is a Band-Aid fix, it is much less expensive for the owner than redoing all the things which caused this to be necessary. So this is kind of a sledgehammer approach, but it certainly did the trick for the cost of a $1.50 capacitor and very little time. The next thing I'm going to do on this before I do a playing test is I'm going to disconnect the HT center tap wire from this ground point and move it over here, like I mentioned. And that should get rid of all the hum that's left. And it's already very low hum after this change, and this change. And I want to show you one more thing, then we'll get to the playing test. We'll hear how it sounds. In yesterday's video, I mentioned that the pot tapers in this amp were not correct for the volume and treble controls. This amp uses 10% taper pots. The original Fenders, the Princetons, I'm trying to get this to focus. It's hard to focus on white things. Used J-taper, 30% tolerance, sometimes called 25%. You know, pot tolerances are an approximate thing, but a J-taper is a 20 to 30% taper pot. Audio taper is usually 10%, some approach 20. So sometimes you luck out with a regular pot. But that means that on this amp, with these controls at noon, you're only at 10% of the maximum of that pot. And I've confirmed that that's the case. This one's like 11, this one's like 12. To get the sound of the 60s Fender at noon, you have to have these up about 230. So that is equivalent to that on an old Princeton. Now, when it comes to this amp, which has 6L6s and bigger iron, it's a louder amp, that's kind of moot. It doesn't really matter here. It would matter if there was a bright cap on this pot. There's not a bright cap. A bright cap here, if you had the pot here versus here, that would make a little bit of a difference. You get a faster range where it gets less bright. So if you want it to be louder get louder faster. J-taper is great here, but there's not a pressing need to change this pot. But the treble pot, what is balanced sounding on a Princeton, a real one, is dark sounding in the same position on this amp. To get this to be balanced sounding, like the Princeton is at noon, you have to have the treble up here. And you think, well, no big deal, right? The thing is, the way pot tapers work, on the Princeton, if that's balanced, you have from here to about here before it gets too bright for most people. So you've got a pretty wide range of balance to bright. You can go really bright if you want for exaggerated effects, but most people don't play it above that. So you've got pretty much from noon to 3 o'clock, you've got a wide range of fine control over how bright it is. With this amp, with the pot that's in there, that's balanced. That's where it gets too bright. So you've got a really narrow sweet spot right around here, and the change can be very exaggerated. And so it's really hard to dial it in just right. You can do it, but that's why I recommended to the owner, and he's going to change that out for a J-taper, at least for the treble. And that'll make this much more useful. Much better to say, I want a little more treble. There it is, rather than, I want a little more treble. Oh, it's too much, too little, too much, too little. There it is, don't move it, don't touch it. The wind picks up, too bright. Anyway, we put this back together and we'll do a playing test and see how the hum is in the real world.